Okay, could you please all sit down so that we can get started? Okay, my name is Christian Dustmann, and I would like to thank you all for coming to the inaugural conference of the Australasian Society for Labor Economics, ASLE. Let me just say a little bit about how this whole thing actually started. The idea for the society started at the EALE conference in Ghent in 2016, where Bob and Meng were attending, and we were discussing the incredible rise, actually, of applied economics, the data available, the researchers who are now working in the Asian and Australasian area, not just in applied economics, but particularly so in labor economics, and the future of that field in the region. We realized, however, that there was no equivalent association like EALE in Europe or SOLE in the US. There was no umbrella which brings all these people together. And after many glasses of wine, we kind of thought it would be great to found an equivalent society in Asia and Australasia for the sake of collaboration within the Asian and Australasian area, but also between Europe, North America, Australasia, and Asia. Particularly so because it will greatly benefit what, well, we always should push with everything we have, and that is the next generation of labor economists and applied economists. It would create an umbrella to connect young people, to allow them to collaborate, and will allow for academic mobility. Now, that was the idea. When I then visited ANU in December of the same year, it occurred to me on a beautiful day like this that actually ANU may be a fantastic place to start that type of society. I spoke to the director of the RSE, who is sitting here, Professor Rabi Turki, who was immediately open to that idea and supported it very enthusiastically. He offered financial support we started to plan for this particular conference. That's why we are here in wonderful and sunny Canberra, where we have now the first meeting of the society. Now, at the moment, the society has not been established. There are many steps we still have to take. We had the first executive board meeting, which is a board which has not been elected yet, but that will be the case for the next board. We have to establish the society legally in an Asian country, and we have already had some ideas where we will have the next meeting, which most likely will be next year in Hong Kong. But I will say more about that at the assembly meeting after Eddie Lazier's talk towards the end of this conference. Now, this conference involves a lot of work, and I would like to thank the various people without whom this would have been totally impossible. First and foremost, without the encouragement and the support of the director of the RSE, Professor Rabi Turki, and the interim dean of CBE, Professor Stephen Roberts, this would not have actually been possible. The team here, in particular Meng, Bob, and John Tang, were incredible in their support and their work to make this conference possible. The Center for Research and Analysis of Migration at CREAM in London, at UCL in London, was doing incredible work throughout the entire stages of this operation. Alice Kukla, Sebastian Otten, and Maria Lambranidou were essential for many parts of this thing. And then, of course, the excellent support team at ANU, Lily, Lucy, Anetta, Carissa, Amy, and Andrew, put incredible work in making all this happen. We have top speakers from the US and North America and Europe who made their very long way to kind of make this conference a big success. David, Steve, Swati, Eddie, Yasuyuki, and Thomas, thank you all for coming here. Now, as you can see, this is a very expensive undertaking, and Rabi's support and incredible encouragement was very important, but we also have a lot of other funders which I would like to briefly mention. The Office of the Chief Economist, the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science, the Treasury, the Australian Taxation Office, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the Department of Social Security, the Department of Employment and Productivity Commission, the Center of Economic History at ANU, the Center for Research and Analysis of Migration at UCL, were all funding in one way or the other this particular enterprise. In particular, we appreciate the help of BankWest, who, through the BankWest Curtin Economic Center, provided the sponsorship for tonight's talk by David Card. Let me introduce you now to the Vice Chancellor of the ANU, Professor Brian Schmidt, who will make some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Christian, and welcome everyone. Before we start, as we do here in Australia, I'd like to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australian on whose traditional lands we meet, and pay my respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present. Canberra is a meeting place, and it's been a meeting place of the Ngunnawal people for over 21,000 years, and the place they met is actually in the center of the ANU campus. So we like to think of the university's power to convene going back literally thousands of generations. And so I think it's worth reflecting on that here today as we meet. So before we get on to the job of Christian introducing our speaker, Professor David Card, I'd really like to also express my thanks on behalf of the university for all of the people who have made this conference possible. I know that Professor Dustman, who we've just heard from, who has a visiting role here at ANU and is at the University of College London, along with our own people here at ANU, including Professor Jin Meng, Emeritus Professor Bob Gregory, and Dr. John Tang, need a huge amount of thanks and congratulations on pulling off this substantive conference. Of course, none of it would be possible without Rabi Turki and Professor Stephen Roberts' work, the interim dean we have for the College of Business and Economics. I know how much work this is, and I know that Bob Gregory has been telling me about how much work it is for the last year. And as I was telling our speaker, as a vice chancellor, one of the great things to do is to make sure that Bob Gregory has an extra project to work on. Makes your life a lot easier. This conference and the establishment of the Asian and Australasian Society of Labor Economics are truly important and heroic initiatives because so much of the world's future, and especially that of Australia, is linked to the rapid economic growth of Asia. And as Vice Chancellor of the Australian National University, that has in our remit, we have a charter written in a government document that basically says we will understand our region of the Asia and the Pacific. And so clearly understanding how the economy in this part of the world is unfolding is going to be paramount if we're going to have some sense of what 2017 and beyond will bring. So we express our remit to government as the national university in a number of ways, but in economics is probably the longest standing and most profound way that we do it. But we also bring in cultural studies, language studies, strategic studies, and a whole range of other things. And I encourage you to take the opportunity to wander onto our campus, and although it's under construction right now, it's a very large campus, and so most of it is still great to walk around. We have 7 species of cockatoos, which is just one species of parrots, for example. Try to see if you can find them all. It's almost like Pokemon. So For me, being able to have our university sponsor an event like this is exactly the type of things that a vice chancellor wants to happen. I have a particular soft spot for economics, as I am a trailing spouse to an economist, and so I've got to go on to everything from the Lindau meeting earlier this year of Nobel laureates in economics, where I think I more or less understood most of what was going on, and I'm looking forward to tonight's speech, because it is something that I have developed a great deal of amateur fondness. I'm not your typical physicist who hears the first talk in economics and believes that all of physics now can be deployed in economics to solve everything, as is wont of many of my colleagues. So welcome to ANU. We encourage you to, as I said, get out and enjoy the summer weather here and all the things that Canberra has. Some of the best coffee in the world, not something some of you would think about, but truly one of our fortes. Of course, all the museums, the wildlife, the great walks, the bicycling, and of course, this amazing group of peers who you can discuss economics in its fullest right now. So without further ado, I'll hand back to Christian to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Okay. Now to introduce David Card is actually not really necessary. David is 1950 professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley. And then I could now go on for a very long time, which I don't really want to do. I just want to say something maybe a little bit more personal. I myself consider David as the most significant and creative labor economist today. He started many new ideas and many new fields of research and initiatives in our discipline. Well, to mention his work on minimum wages, immigration, racial conflict, discrimination, and many more areas, and recently the role of the firm about which he will talk today. David has also made many methodological innovations, like the first papers on difference in difference, and many others who followed that particular project. He sets new standards for empirical research. He did that for a very long time, and he continues to do so. But not just academically, David has done a lot. What I always learned from David and always admired in David is his incredible support for the next generation of labor economists. He's an excellent supervisor, and he has gone out of his way to support and to push young people, not just from North America, but around the world. One very interesting evidence for that is the way he has handled his role as running the labor studies group at NBR, which was a very closed shop for North Americans. David opened it up for scholars from around the world, introduced many new innovations in that group, and if you go to the NBR meetings, well, basically that's the biggest show in town. It's by far the most frequented meeting of all the workshops there. Now, my personal relation, David was on my thesis committee in 1992. I never met him, however, because he couldn't make it to Florence, where I did my PhD at the time. I met him the first time when he received the Clark Medal at the AEA meetings in San Francisco, and we went for dinner afterwards, and I kind of found out that David is not only an excellent economist, but he knows a lot about food and wine. We have been good friends ever since, and in the years which followed, we would talk a lot about labor economics, politics, etc. But in particular, and most importantly, we intensified our knowledge about good food and good wine at various places around the world, and we studied that with great passion. Now, given that this is the inaugural conference of a new society which is related to labor economics, which covers Asia and Australasia, I think we are very privileged and very lucky to have the greatest labor economist presenting the keynote talk, David Card.
Well, thank you, Christian, for that. It's very over-the-top introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very impressed with the ability of the team to get such a good conference together. It's difficult to found a new society. Eddie Lazear is here, and he founded the Society of Labor Economics back in the 1980s, early 80s, along with a journal, and that really had a big influence on the field of labor economics. And hopefully, I think Klaus Zimmerman is here. He founded the journal Population Economics, which had a big effect in that field. And so hopefully the next step for this society will be a journal as well, or some kind of similar impact. So it's great to be here and be in the presence of some of these important mentors of the field as well. What I'm going to do is talk about a body of research which I've been working on, and others have been working on for the last 10 years or so, about the role of firms in labor market outcomes. Most non-economists think that when you're thinking of the labor market, it's all about jobs. And if you talk to a policy analyst, they will typically say, well, we've got to get good jobs in our town. And in the neoclassical type of models that we usually use, there isn't really such thing as a job. In fact, Eddie Lazear has a paper called The Job as a Concept, which I always thought was a great title. Not one of his best-known papers, but it's definitely, he was sort of struggling with exactly how do we think of a job in labor economics. Now, there is a class of models that was developed in the 1980s, frictional labor market models, the DMP, Diamond, Martinson, Pissarides type models, where they thought of a job as an idiosyncratic match between a specific employer and a specific worker. That is a potential model, at least it's logically consistent. I like when I'm trying to think about labor economics. Labor economics is a very different field than almost all the rest of economics. Very little labor economics arises because someone sits with pen and paper and takes derivatives or thinks about functions or things like that. Most of it comes from School of Hard Knocks. And I have three brothers, one of whom is a farmer, one of whom is in the theater business, and one of whom is a teacher. And they have a very sanguine view of my work, since I don't ever seem to work, as far as they can tell. Anyway, their view, and so I usually try and test out any idea on them. Their view is, it's pretty obvious. A good job is working at a good firm. And the whole idea of, if you're kind of a blue-collar person, is to get to a good job in a good firm. And so I'm going to talk about that idea. I'm going to argue that firms matter a lot in the labor markets today, that firms offer systematic wage premiums that are very easy to measure and very predictable relative to other firms in the same market, that the variation in these premiums is large and growing, that more productive firms are the ones that pay these higher premiums on average, and that these premiums actually are very useful for understanding lots of things like rising inequality, gender gap, returns to education, and things like that. So many of the things that we think about in the labor market have some impact of the role of the firms here. I'm going to talk about four different things. First, I'm going to give an overview of some of the underlying theory and evidence that's related to this area. I'm going to then talk about some of the empirical work that I've developed in collaboration with my colleague Pat Klein over the years. And then I'm going to talk about an interpretation. So my interpretation of this particular thing is very straightforward, but is extremely controversial. So I'm going to tell you my interpretation. I don't really expect more than 20% of people to believe it. Then I'm going to talk about research on what things about the labor market can be explained by firm wage premiums. I'll mention a few of these as we go along, and then I'll mention an agenda for further work. So in the standard model that economists use for studying most problems, there's no such thing as firms, actually. There's constant returns to scale. There's a production function. Actually, the size of any given firm is irrelevant. And each firm faces a horizontal supply curve at the market wage, so the firm size is indeterminate. So our standard models that we use don't really have firms. Now, there's a really good reason for that, which is the origins of the field are the development of microdata starting in the 1960s, where we collected information from people on what they earned and what their education was and their gender and their race and where they lived and so on. We didn't have a way to connect people to firms. We could ask you who your employer was, but that would be confidential information, so we couldn't really use that. That wasn't released on the data files. Moreover, we didn't know who worked with who. So as a shortcut, it was just obvious that we would take, this is the model that was in John Hick's 1932 book on labor economics. And so we took Hicks's model and we ran with that because it worked. We didn't have firms. We don't need no snake in firms. And that's the working model even today for many models, many questions in our field, including aspects of trade, immigration, skill-based technical change, minimum wages, occupational choice, local labor markets. Now, my view is that that model doesn't work that well in many of these things, and so one of the reasons why you might be interested in understanding whether firms matter is because you might think some of these areas, the standard model has not done that well. There is a slightly more modern version of that model where firms are extremely heterogeneous. So take away the idea that all firms are the same and replace it with the idea that there may be different entrepreneurial talents. Ed's going to talk about entrepreneurism in the context of personnel economics at the end of the conference. Firms differ in various attributes like entrepreneurial skill, management practices, special patents, they could have market power, whatever. And in those models, you can get a story about why firms are different, but at the fundamental level of the workers, firms still don't matter individually. So the way that we can explain this to my brothers is that it doesn't really matter if you live in the Bay Area, whether you work for Google or not. As long as Google is in the Bay Area, they're going to raise wages for everybody who could work for Google. Now, I wish that was true. That would be extremely helpful to people like me. So I think that, if you put it that way, it's pretty obvious, I think, to most people that there's something wrong with that model. Now, that doesn't mean that it isn't useful for some purposes, but it doesn't actually describe that piece of reality. Let me now talk a little bit about earlier work. Our field is one of the unusual fields, not only in that it's empirically driven, but that it has a long tradition of empirical work much earlier than virtually any serious empirical work. I mean, macro has empirical work, but much more serious empirical work, starting really in the 1940s, and even sometimes in the 1930s. And so in the 1970s, Craig Riddell, who's in this room someplace, I don't see him, but he wrote a paper in Econometrica in 1974 estimating micro-Phillips curves with wage contracting data. Using that kind of approach, there was a literature that developed over the course of the 1970s and 80s which showed quite a bit of variation in wage setting. However, those were models about a market imperfection. They were models where there was a union setting wages over and above the wages that would prevail in the market. And so that was, and still is in many people's minds, a model for linking firm-specific outcomes to workers. They're thinking in their heads, well, the reason why firms matter is because firms have a union contract or something like that. And I'm going to come back and talk about that, but I would like to point out that actually these days in many, many countries, that's just not true. Even Australia no longer has the strong intermediation of institutional forces in the labor market. So in that literature, there were no workers because you didn't have data on workers. You only had data essentially on union contracts. There was a literature that developed in the 60s and 70s and even into the 1980s using panel data sets. The first panel data sets, well, this is like the Hilda type data set, came out in the mid-1960s. And those data sets eventually started to collect information that allowed you to say, this year, this person works for a different employer than they worked for last year. You still didn't know who worked for who, and you still didn't know who was a coworker of who. But you knew that someone had changed jobs. And research along those lines showed that changing jobs was extremely important. And people, actually macroeconomists finally got the message. So in the last 10 years, a lot of macro models have started to develop models of the risk. They're concerned about risk that people have in their income fluctuations, where one of the major components of risk is the chance that you'll lose your current job and move to another job. And so that's starting to be built in. It's not entirely clear in that literature what people were thinking. I think a lot of people who worked in that literature assumed that what they were estimating was something like the Diamond, Mortensen, Pissarides view, where you are a particularly good fit at one job versus another job, and therefore when you take that job, you'll get a raise. Now, of course, if you're actually really a market person, that isn't even true, right? Why would you get a raise just because you're a good fit? If your wage should be determined by outside forces. So that in itself is outside of a standard model. But in these models, an individual career would consist of accumulating human capital as well as some accumulation of match capital. And you could lose that match capital if your job got destroyed. And so that is a logically consistent model. And that is, in some sense, a competing model to the set of ideas that I'm going to be speaking of today. Now, in the 1990s, there was a lot of research on displaced workers. And two of my students, Bob Lalonde and Dan Sullivan, wrote one of the most influential papers in our field in that era, which documented in a very straightforward way something that my brothers would have known right away, which is if you were working at a large firm and you had been there for a number of years and lost that job, you were going to suffer significant permanent earnings losses on the order of 10 to 25%, depending on how you do it. Those losses are bigger in recessions, recent research has shown. They're fairly similar in Germany and the United States and other countries as far as anyone can tell. They seem to be, in my view, too big and too persistent to be easily explained by match effects. It seems like once you lose that job, those opportunities have disappeared. And I think people are interested, for instance, in the Australian context, they're very interested in the question, did the closing of the auto sector in Adelaide area, did that lead to the same kind of thing that occurred in Pennsylvania in the 1980s, which was what Jacobson, Lalonde, and Sullivan were studying? And my guess would be yes. Finally, there's another body of research, mostly not done by economists, labor economists, that looks at firm-level data sets. And this analysis has discovered something that is potentially quite disruptive. And you see various versions of this talked about quite a bit. Essentially, what seems to be true is there's enormous heterogeneity in the firms in the same industry. And those weaker firms with lower productivity don't just disappear. They aren't driven out of business in any kind of real-time sense. So as a result of that, there's enormous potential gains to reallocating workers across firms. And Shea and Klenow have one of the most famous papers in this area, which sort of documents the enormous heterogeneity in the US and then says, well, however big that is, it's much bigger in other countries. They use China as an example, where you could make an argument that that's some kind of evidence of inefficiency in the allocation of capital or management of firm management or whatever. There's another research body which shows that this productivity is partially related to management skills, but there's, in that literature, relatively little information on worker quality. Okay. Finally, there's a theoretical body of work on frictional markets. I mentioned the DMP model. The competing model is the so-called job ladder model. And my own view is that the job ladder model is a more successful model for understanding most aspects of the labor market in the sense that there's firms in that model, and firms have wage setting policies, and there's a component of wages in these models which is essentially a rent if you get a job there relative to other jobs. Nevertheless, firms are indifferent, and it's because this is a dynamic monopsony model where some firms are paying low wages and having a lot of turnover, others are paying high wages and having less turnover, and those two forces are equilibrating in the equilibrium of this job ladder model. And there's a variety of extensions of these classes of models. And then finally, there's a literature, an empirical literature, which I have looked at a number of times and written a little bit on over the years, and I call it the modern rent-sharing literature. It's a literature which is trying to show without any particular theoretical framework, that when workers work for a firm, it's advantageous to work for a more profitable firm. And the usual interpretation of that is that for some reason, firms that have more profits are willing to spill some of their profits down to employees. I don't really know where this idea came from. It does make sense in a union setting where you say, okay, a union is going to force this firm to pay higher wages. They're going to hold them up with some kind of threat of strike or something. But the general tendency is to think of it as a little broader than that. Anyway, that literature shows that typically the elasticity of wages with respect to value add per worker at a firm is around 5 to 10%. Not large, but large enough because of the enormous heterogeneity in value added per worker across firms. That's a number, that the standard deviation of the log value added per worker is a number at least 1. So that's going to generate a component of variance in wages that's at least 0.05 and possibly 0.1. And I have a paper with Ana Cardozo, Jörg Heinig, and Pat Klein, where we replicate some of the standard specifications in the literature with data from, very detailed data from Portugal. And we can show very clearly that, that seems to be a fairly pervasive problem, and you can get those numbers very easily. Okay. So with that background, let me now talk about the framework for measuring these firm-specific wage-setting premiums. And I think everybody in the room is aware of this set of work. This was invented by my first co-author, John Abowd, was the first person I worked with when I got my PhD at Chicago. I guess Eddie had hired both of us, actually. I don't know whether Eddie hired Ed, but Eddie hired me. So anyway, we were there. John came up with this idea after that, so I don't get any credit for that. But anyway, what he thought of was something it's so incredibly straightforward that many people take an automatic dislike to it. Because they say, if the world is that simple, I quit. It's something like that. It's something like, there's a problem with economics. So we can't believe that something as boneheaded simple as this can actually be like a valid statistical model. This is not an economic model. This is a statistical model. And it says that a person's wage at a point in time can be decomposed into a person effect, which represents something that's going to be persistent no matter what employer they worked at. A firm effect, which is going to be a firm-specific premium. Other people that work at that same firm are going to get the same differential. And so you can see I'm going to need to be able to identify who works with who. Then there's going to be some components that vary within the worker over time, and then error term. And in this error term, there's a bunch of components. One part are things that are transitory, things like health shocks, changes in overtime hours that we're not measuring, things like that. Another part is, so I live in California, I work at Berkeley, 50 miles away to Stanford, and so everybody at Stanford is paid, let's say, 20% more than everybody at Berkeley. But there might be some variation. So there could be some people who get like 22% higher at Stanford, and there could be people who get 18% higher. And that would be something like a component that deviates from the person effect and the firm effect, but is persistent within the job. And I'll call that the match effect. And so that job match effect means that there's a potential heterogeneous treatment effect. We're going to lose resolution. I hate heterogeneous treatment effects anyway. They're such pain in whatever. So anyway, and that heterogeneous treatment effect is an object of fixation by many theorists because it seems to them obvious, to many people except my brothers, it seems to them obvious that if you switch jobs voluntarily, you must have done that to get a higher wage, and therefore, if I see someone go from firm A to firm B, that person must get a higher wage at firm B. If I see in the same data set in the same year somebody going from firm B to firm A, that person must have got a higher wage at firm B. So it can't be that this class of models is correct, because this class of models says think of somebody who changes jobs from A to B. One way they lose the firm effect at A and gain the firm effect at B, everything else stays constant. The other way it goes the opposite direction. So there should be a symmetry there that is very fundamentally hard to convince people that that could possibly be true. Okay. So Pat and Jörg and I came up with a way to show there's some evidence. We were thinking actually of my brothers. And we were thinking of how it could be that we would show what everybody knows in the labor market. And everybody knows the following. Compare two firms. Firm A, everybody else in the firm is paid $35 an hour. Firm B, everybody else in the firm is paid $20 an hour. Okay, which firm do you want to work at? You want to work at the one where everybody else is paid high. There's a $15 wage difference between those two firms. How much of that are you going to get? Well, maybe not all of it, because there might be some differences in the types of workers at each firm, but you're going to get some fraction of that. And my brothers definitely think that's true. So what we did was we selected people who changed jobs. We stratified the previous job that they had and the job that they moved to in terms of the co-worker average wage. So this doesn't include them. This is everybody else but them. In 4 quartiles. And we show what happens, and I think a number of people many of you have probably seen this picture. I love it so much, I'm going to bring it up anyway. This is a picture showing groups of people who started at quartile 4 coworkers. This is another group who started at quartile 1 coworkers. So these guys are working at McDonald's, and these guys are working at Stanford. Okay? And they're going along, and then at this point, there's 1 year, then another year, then they change jobs, and now they're at new firms. Okay? And the people at the top there, this is data from Germany, full-time men, 2002 to 2009. People at the top there are going from one firm to another firm that's in the top quartile of coworkers' wages, and their wages are very flat. These guys were at a 4th quartile firm and go down to a 1st quartile firm, and they lose a lot. This is a log scale, so they're losing about 40 log points of wages. Now, obviously, many of those people probably preferred not to have that happen to them. So we wouldn't necessarily think of this as voluntary mobility. Is there anything that can be done about the sun, or is that just a whole list? Oh, okay. Perfect. Okay. So these guys here is the other story. These are guys that are at McDonald's and they move to Burger King. Okay? So they don't really get anything of that. These guys were at other low quartile firms, a little bit better than those on average, but they're going to move, these guys move to the 4th quartile firm, and they're going to get about a 35 log point wage increase. So these are enormous wage changes. One thing that we were really surprised with when we first did this analysis is we thought it might be true that the people who, like this guy is really getting unlucky and is going to lose a really good job and go to something else crappy. We thought it might be true that that point would be down here because there'd be some kind of free trend, right? And actually, my thesis advisor and old friend, Orly Eschenfelter, invented a kind of a model, statistical model of this for entering training programs. In labor economics, in our field, that would have been called an Eschenfelter dip, right? No Eschenfelter dip in the data. This is the same kind of picture for Portugal. Now, in the 1990s, this is the data from the 2000s. In the 2000s, wages in Germany were flat or falling for most workers. Wages in Portugal were rising, which tells you why there's so much trouble in Europe. So these have a little bit of a trend in them. But the pictures look almost the same. And I have data like this for Brazil and Italy and many other countries, and they always look the same. So the picture looks fairly similar. This is a data, I'm going to do one more version of this. I'm going to ask the following question. When I change jobs and I get my coworkers' wages are 10% higher, how much do my wages go up? So what I do here is I classify jobs into 20 buckets now, and I've got 20 sending categories and 20 receiving categories, so 400 possible buckets, and I'm going to plot the change in wages for an individual worker against the change in wages for coworkers in these 400 buckets. And this is what the data looks like. It's a thing of beauty. Down here are the people who are starting. They're the big losers. Okay, their coworkers' wages are falling. The way that that can happen is they start at the top. Okay, this is like mean progression in action. So they started at the top. So this is somebody who was working in the 19th decile, lost that job. Most of the time, they're going to go down. And up here, these are the people who are starting at the bottom. So they can only go up. So they were starting in group of intile number 1, and they're going to rise. But you can see this is an amazing regularity. The slope of that line is about 0.43. So and I've done a similar picture to this in Brazil and in Germany, and it's about the same. And it looks the same for men and women. You can even look at, if you're a male or female, let's say, is this slope, and I put the male coworkers' changes here, and you're female, do I get the 40% or do I get a little bit less? And I'm going to talk about that later. It turns out you get a little bit less. Okay, so the takeaways from this analysis and this literature is that wages fall or rise a lot when you join firms with different paid coworkers. There's large gaps. There's no average mobility premium. So just moving but not changing coworker wages doesn't do you any good. There are approximately symmetric gains and losses, so there doesn't seem to be much of this match component driving sorting. There's no clear trends before or after the no Eschenfelter dips. Upward mobile wages have higher base level wages given their origin quartile. So these guys, there is evidence of sorting on the permanent ability component. So there is a correlation in that data between worker and firm level analysis. Now, let me then move quickly, because I'm going to run out of time, and talk about what happens when you apply this kind of framework, this AKM type framework. I'm going to show data for Germany, full-time men in the 2000s, men and women separately in Portugal, and I'm going to show data project looking at race groups in Brazil by gender and race, trying to see whether some of the lower wages for what they classify races in multiple categories in Brazil, but basically brown and black workers in Brazil, relative to white. And I'm going to show the data for white workers here. And this is a kind of a summary. I've got the share of the variance of wages explained by different things. So in all these countries, person effects explain something like between 45 and 55% of variance. Firm effects explain around 20%. That seems to be solid. There is a positive correlation between the worker and firm effects. Abowd got that wrong in his first paper and completely screwed up the literature for 10 years because they didn't do the computing right. But there's a very strong positive correlation. Now, why is that important? It's important because it means that on average, the better workers, the workers who have higher earnings no matter where they work, are working at the firms that pay higher premiums. We all know that. The better people work at Stanford rather than Berkeley, right? So that's pretty clear. And so that contributes to rising inequality because it's like a version of the Matthew effect. Those who have a lot get more. The residual component, these models have an amazingly good R-squared, adjusted for the degrees of freedom. You're using up a lot of degrees of freedom, but you're getting like a 95% R-squared in that model. 90 to 93% R-squared in that model. That is pretty, by labor economist standards, that's amazing. That says there's almost nothing left to explain. You can compare it to a model in which you just include job dummies. Okay? That's the completely non-parametric version of this. Just include the job dummies. Thinking about breaking down jobs into worker and firm components, that's a very parsimonious version of a job model. It says there isn't really such thing as jobs. There's workers and there's firms. Okay? That only increases your adjusted R-squared by 2 percentage points or less. And so there's not much of a gain. There is some gain and statistically significant, but in terms of economic understanding of the labor market, it is remarkable how well this class of models work. Okay? So my view is that, then there's one last thing. How big is the match effect? So the match effect is the part that is your deviation from what you should get just on the basis of your permanent person effect and the firm you're at. And this is the ratio of the variance of the match effect to the variance of the firm effect. Okay, and it's around 5 or 6%. In Portugal, it's a little higher. In Germany, around 10%. It's quite a bit higher in Brazil. But it's still relatively modest. So there is a match component. This is sort of a permanent deviation from that ACAM specification, which is why this R-squared is higher than that. But it's not enormously high. Okay. What about interpretation? So now I'm going to move on to talking about interpretation. So there's 2 empirical facts in these analysis that are worth thinking about and knowing. One is that the firms that have higher wage premiums survive longer. So paying high wages is not a bad thing. Okay? That's inconsistent with this idea that you've been forced to pay those high wages and you're gradually going out of business. Which is, there's a big literature studying unions that way and suggesting that unions extract rents, raise wages, and eventually unionized firms go out of business. So that doesn't seem to be true in these data. Premiums are correlated with profits. I'll talk a bit more about that. The jobs at high-wage firms survive longer. That's consistent with the idea that the individual workers actually prefer those jobs, and not that they get a high wage there, but they have to work hard. There's nothing in these data that allows you to say that some component of the wage that you're offered that's higher at one firm than another is due to conditions on that job, like you have to work harder or you're required to put in a little bit longer hours or something. And obviously, there's some room for that. Some researchers believe that's pretty significant. My view is that it's actually fairly small, but that's not completely resolved. There's a modest widening of these premiums over time in Germany. And the big thing that's obvious in the German data is that the newer firms that came into Germany starting in the 1990s were much more likely to offer lower wage premiums. And so part of the fall in wages for lower skilled workers in Germany in that period after 1996 was due to the fact that most of the new jobs were quite a bit crappier than the old jobs, which of course I don't have any brothers in Germany, but they would have all been able to tell me that because it'd be common knowledge to everybody but economists. Okay, so next question. Is this wage premium rent sharing? There's a lot of literature on that. We tried, talked about this. We tried to show that the AKM firm-specific wage premium is correlated with the value added per worker. It's very systematically correlated. The problem is, I don't actually think that it makes sense in a population data set of these types to think about firms voluntarily sharing rents. Okay? The rise in these premiums in Germany is occurring at precisely the time that unions are disappearing. And the threat of unionization is basically going to zero. So if you think that these premiums are reflecting union bargaining power and variation in that, I don't think that's logically consistent. So I think, and similarly in the United States, to the extent we can study this in the United States, there essentially is no union sector in the private sector. There's essentially trivial component there. So to the extent we can see the same patterns in the United States, it suggests that if this is rent sharing, it's very peculiar. Like, why are firms sharing rents? And I've always had that view. Like, why do firms want to share rents? So I'm going to propose an alternative view, which is that it's just wage setting. So wages come from somewhere. But back in the 1960s, when we didn't know anything about firms, we assumed that they were handed down from heaven. So there was an auctioneer who set the wages for each individual skill class in the labor market, and there wasn't any market power in individual firms setting wages. Now, I happen to have some friends who do consulting at some very large tech companies in the United States that are doing a lot of experiments on wage setting with those firms. And I can tell you that firms have market power in setting wages, okay? Now, the question is not how they have market power or not. The question is, how big is that market power? So I want to talk about a model where firms have some wage-setting power, and think about what you would expect as a result of that wage-setting power. And so the easy way to do that is to imagine that an individual gets a utility associated with a given job that looks like the exact kind of utility function and exactly the specifications that you use when you think about which car you buy. So this is the labor economist version of IO model number 1, the standard model that everybody who's studying pricing of goods thinks is the go-to model. For some reason, we believe that firms have market power in tuna and ketchup, but no market power in the labor market. And obviously that was fine when we didn't have the ability to study it, but I think it doesn't make sense in the future. So if you have that kind of utility function, this is the utility that worker I gets, who's in skill group S at firm J, and I'm going to imagine that that depends on the deviation of the wage from some benchmark wage for that skill group. S is the skill group. And a component, this is a utility component, that might be idiosyncratic to that firm. So there's various reasons why you want to work at a certain firm. It has a good parking lot. It's disorganized. Lots of things like that. So think of all the reasons why you hate your current job and multiply them by 2 accordingly. So then that model, as everybody knows, gives rise to this very convenient functional form for the probability that people work at those jobs. And exactly as Berry, Levinson, and Pecos have done in I.O., you can say if that's the model for who wants to choose those jobs, it generates supply functions. It generates demand functions on the good side. It generates supply functions on the firm side. And they look very straightforward. If the number of competing firms for a given worker is relatively large, then you can ignore the denominator. Basically, this is a theorem in statistics that the multinomial goes to the quotient. And we get that the fraction of workers in a given labor market in a given skill group who want to work at a firm look like that. Now, if you take logs of both sides, you get an equation. This is the supply of low-skilled workers and high-skilled workers at a given firm. And it depends on some stuff about the labor market that they're in, and then these coefficients on the wage premiums that that firm is offering. Okay? Now, importantly, we reverse engineered this equation to look just like a rent sharing equation. Okay? In the sense that it's going to have the property that there's going to be a wage set above some other level, and it's going to depend on things. And if you take that class of models and think about what it means, a firm has to solve some kind of demand function choice. So a simple model would be one I've got here, where you've got a total factor productivity of the firm, T, a standard, very simple, non-heterogeneous production function, F, and and the firm has, say, ability to sell all it can produce, so it's a competitive firm on the goods market, a non-competitive firm on the labor market. That model gives rise to wage-setting equations that look like this. So the wage for the low-skilled guys is a TJ, that's the productivity of the firm. FL is the marginal product, so this is the marginal factor product. Okay? And this term here is exactly the term that we teach our undergraduates in product pricing. It's the markdown. It's like a markup, but it's the markdown. It depends on the elasticity of labor supply. So that class of models looks like this in one of the types of workers. So there's a supply curve to the firm, which is becoming flat here. There's a marginal factor cost like that. You've got constant marginal factor productivity. So you choose this wage here, and this is the market. And that markdown is on the order of E over 1 plus E. So if the elasticity of supply to the firm is 5, it's like a 15% wage markdown. So you can imagine if the elasticity of supply is 100, the markdown is trivial. If the elasticity of supply is 1, the markdown is very large. And the advantage of this model is it gives rise to wage-setting equations which look exactly like rent-sharing equations. Okay? Pat and I worked very hard to make that true. So we figured out exactly what has to be true to get it that the wage is going to be some outside wage, W bar, plus a coefficient on a measure of rents at the firm level. And that measure of rents is basically total factor productivity normalized by B, which is the kind of the unit of productivity of a given worker. So that's a model that looks like rent sharing, but it's not rent sharing. It's just markdown pricing. Okay? And that class of models works pretty well. I'm going to now talk briefly about what kind of evidence we have about how these wage premiums have affected things. The first paper I worked on this was studying German wage inequality, and in the 1990s, German wage inequality went way up. This is the standard way to show that. This is the 10th percentile relative to 1996 equals 100. So there's a little bit of growth. There's faster growth at the 80th percentile. For the 80th percentile, that growth persisted after 1996. For the other groups, and particularly for the bottom percentiles, wages fell quite substantially. Okay? This is why Portugal is in such trouble, because they're competing against these guys. And their wages were going up. So there was a big increase in inequality, and the question is, what does firm-specific components have to do with that? Well, if you compare fitting an AKM model in different decades of time to Germany, you'll see that there was a big rise in what appears to be kind of the person-specific component variance. So there's a rise in inequality there. There was a rise in the variance of the establishment component, so it became more heterogeneous, more risk if you lost a job at one firm than another. And there was a big increase in the sorting of high-wage workers to high-wage firms. And so this component here contributes 35% of the increase in variance. The firm effect contributes 25%, and the person component, which is sort of the human capital, the skill bias, technical change, all those things, that's about 40%. So we haven't completely overthrown the standard story. We've simply supplemented it with other features that I think are more realistic about the labor market. I can say that we've spent a lot of time working on the gender gap in Portugal. Ana Cardoso had access to this really outstanding data set that the Portuguese collect, which gives you an extremely detailed portrait of each worker each year. And with that analysis, we were able to compare the wage-setting behavior of firms for their female employees and for their male employees. And we asked if it was the case that some of the component of the gender gap in Portugal, which is about the same as it is in the US, is due to the fact that women are excluded from those high-wage firms. Is there some evidence of like differential hiring patterns? Or was it possibly the case that when they went to work at one of those high-wage firms, they didn't get as big a share of the reward? In the class of models I just wrote down before, that would have been because they have a different elasticity of supply, which is exactly Joan Robinson's model from 1933. She thought that one way to explain the gender gap was that women were being monopolized against by their employers. And this is, there's a couple of other papers that have shown something like that, but that's a fairly small component in the Portuguese context. We show that the 20 to 25% of the gender premium in Portugal is due to their distribution across firms. Another 1 or 2% is due to this monopsonistic feature. It's not particularly large. And the analysis I've been doing in Brazil looking at black and white workers shows a similar thing. There seems to be very systematic exclusion of black and brown workers from higher wage firms, although some of that is very strongly correlated with the fact that there's a big education gap for them. And so part of their non-access to high wage firms is because they don't have the high levels of education that those firms seem to demand. How much is left to discrimination is not entirely clear. Okay. Another thing you can possibly explain, and again, I think my brothers would have been able to tell me that this is true, is that to do with how wages adjust over the business cycle. So there's a component of adjustment over the business cycle that's due to people having the same employer when the economy turns bad and just getting a wage cut. And when the economy gets better, they get a wage gain. But there's another potential component, and this is the thing that everybody's worried about, you know, my brothers would be really worried about, which is in the middle of a recession, I'm going to lose my job. And then I'm going to have to take a crappy job and take a big wage cut. And you can decompose then the change in wages for any worker into the change in the firm effect they have, plus other stuff. And when you do that, this is data from Germany over the 2000s. This is the unemployment rate, which rises like crazy in 2005. Then it got this period of remarkable growth between 2005 and 2010, where unemployment is falling steadily. And this is the change in wages for people at continuing jobs. Now, this incorporates a little bit of hours adjustment, so it's, take it with a grain of salt. But you can see when the unemployment rate was high, it was relatively low. When the unemployment rate was starting to fall, it was higher. So that's cyclical, but not very cyclical. On the other hand, if we look at the change in the firm effects for people who switch jobs, it's terrible when it's a recession, and it's positive when it's expansion. So, of course, as I said, my brothers would know that. You don't want to change jobs when there's high unemployment. Bad idea. You want to change jobs when there's low unemployment, because that's normally the time when those opportunities are going to develop. An interesting question is, why is it that all the jobs available in the bottom of the business cycle are low-wage firms? Okay, early career progression. Topel and Ward had a very famous paper, one of the early papers that I mentioned at the beginning. If you look at data, this is data on Portuguese men, and each of these is a different education group. And what I'm showing here is the average firm effect by age. Okay? So this is the kind of human capital that you're accumulating because you're getting to, on average, work for better firms. And there isn't much growth in that for these low-wage guys. There's quite a bit more growth of it for low education. There's quite a bit more growth of it for the different groups. But there's another feature of this graph that's also extremely important in both Portugal and Germany, which is that these guys, on average, are working at crappy firms. These guys, on average, are working at pretty good firms because they've got higher firm effect. So part of the wage gap between high and low educated workers is because of access to high wage firms. So the presence of these firm-specific differentials is contributing to the return to education. And then finally, I'm going to stop here, I think, because I'm out of time. What about the Jacobson and Lon Sullivan exercise? So here's what I did. I took, during the 2005 period, there was a lot of job loss in Germany. And these are people who lost a job, but luckily found a job within a year. So I see them working for 2 years. They lose a job. Then the next 2 years, they're back at work. Now, they've all lost their jobs, and the firm has closed. So it's a large-scale layoff event, excuse me. And so what's happening is their wage is falling. Now, this is their hourly wage. So this is not adjusting for the fact they have lower employment or lower hours. This is just their hourly wage. It's fallen about 8 or 9%. And all of that is because they're basically going to a lower wage firm. Okay, so this is exactly consistent with this idea that some of the earnings loss you see in those studies is because you're basically losing that capital associated with having found a high-wage employer. So let me close with saying there's a few other things that I'm aware of that people are doing, and a lot of things I'm not aware of that people are doing. Racial wage gaps, immigrant assimilation, income in the top 1%. There's a lot of interest in networks, and access to good firms is probably through networks. Those networks could start at college. So there's a nice study in Chile showing that if you go to the right high school, it gets you access to the right university, which then gets you access to high-wage firms. And so that's a feature of the economy that is building off of this heterogeneity in firms, which actually matters, and helps us get some insight into how inequality is pervaded. Now, the final thing I want to say is that I think that in the next 20 years, I'm very hopeful that this kind of work will be possible in many more countries. So currently, most of this work is not really possible in many Asian countries because there isn't any administrative data. It's starting to be possible. I think, maybe in 10 years it will be possible to do this in Australia. In the next few years, it's going to be possible in New Zealand. So I think that there's a frontier here, and I really hope that people will be able to pursue this work, because I'm not necessarily expecting that all of the patterns we see here will hold in other labor markets, and I think we really need to know. And people, our job as a labor economist is to go out there and say, we can do all of this stuff, but we need the data. And once we have the data, we'll be able to tell you a lot more about your market than you currently know. And it's going to be, otherwise we're just going to keep knowing about Sweden. I mean, I love Sweden, it's a great country, but I don't really think that, we want to have our knowledge base quite that limited. Anyway, so thanks very much for inviting me, and I'll take some questions. If I pay you a higher wage, can I get a little bit more effort out of you, or a little bit more equivalent to that? And I think that's quite possible. We haven't figured out how to test that. And so I think that's really interesting. There may be data sets, probably soon, that will that will have some kind of measure of something like an effort variable. So it would not necessarily be hours. It would be something like how productive you are per hour.
Even staying on the job long for a long period means the boss has your given.
Yeah, there's one version of efficiency wages that work like that too. Yeah, and you, as you know, and you could also say it's some kind of firm-specific knowledge I'm developing, and I'm incentivizing that. So that's a version of the salad model. Actually, yeah. So I think those things are quite feasible. Yeah. Go ahead.
How do you explain the rise, not just in Australia, but in many countries, in the dispersion of earnings or the inequality of earnings using these ideas?
Right. Okay. So.
And particularly the top 1%. Maybe they're not.
Yeah. Okay. So.
For instance.
So the research that I've done is by necessity. It's in many countries the top percentiles of wages are sensitive. So for instance, in Germany, which would probably be the most interesting country to study this of the countries I've looked at. Portugal, the top 1% isn't that well off. In Germany, the top 1% are pretty well paid as far as anyone can tell. But the Social Security earnings records that we're using are censored at around the 90th percentile. So the problem is that we haven't been able to study that. Now, I think what we can show is, some research is starting to show that the component of the wage premium is fairly similar for most groups of workers, but potentially different at the very top. Right? In other words, if I thought of my equation where I say I'm going to relate your wages to some measure of the kind of productivity or rents or whatever at your employer, that coefficient could be different for different skill groups. On average, for the broad class of skill groups that I've looked at, which would be like high and low educated workers in Germany and Portugal and Brazil, it's pretty similar. But I think at the very top, there's a lot of room. And there's a lot of new research in the German setting suggesting that one of the economic reasons why some firms have outsourced, say their janitors and their logistics operations, is to avoid paying these high premiums to their workforce. So there's a company like Siemens or something, or has a very highly paid engineering workforce. They're paying substantially above market, and suddenly some manager comes in and says, we don't have to pay our janitors 20% more too, just the engineers. And I think there's a lot of that going on. There's some evidence that that's happening in Germany, and my guess is it's happening in a lot of other places too. most, I don't know. In my view, in the United States, we don't have training. There's many studies in our field which have shown, somebody got a lot of money to get the NLS to collect information. Lisa Lynch did this. She got a lot of money to collect information on training, and it's like studying, I don't know, snowballs in hell. There wasn't any. So it can't be very large in a lot of countries. Germany it could be, but I haven't really seen it. It would be something to do. I think it's quite interesting. I'm working on a project where we're using data from Italy, and we're trying to see whether, so the early stages of your career are most important to people. So the first 10 years of your working life, if you're highly educated, your wages are going to double. If you're less educated, they're maybe going to rise by 30–40%. And a really interesting question to me is, does that vary by firm? So that's a slow question. And then, is that related to the gender gap? Because the gender gap in most countries is relatively small when you first enter the labor market and it widens over time. So you can ask the following question. Is there firms where the women don't have a flatter slope than the men? And what are they doing? Is there something? So we're starting a project to do that, but I don't know what we're going to find. So I think it's a very interesting question.
Thanks for this response. Could I just ask, where might individual preferences fit into the model?
Individual preferences.
Yeah. So, for example,
Yeah.
people, you might consider, people might choose to go into a lower wage job.
Yeah, that model I wrote down was a model of individual utility, right? And it has a type 1 extreme value error term, just like all good low-bit models. And it has a firm-specific unobserved component, just like in a BLP model with product price setting. So you can do it exactly the same way in terms of the supply function. That's a very naive model, but it captures some of that. There's a kind of unobserved component and idiosyncratic component. So I like a particular firm that is closer to my house. You like a different one because it's further from that kind of thing. That would be the way. So that's the advantage, I think, of thinking about these premiums as coming from a markup pricing model, because we know how to deal with those models. We've got a lot of technology in I/O of how to estimate them. And so I think they also have a lot of interesting features. For example, that class of model says when you force a minimum wage in the economy, it could be that some small firms, which were very unproductive, are going to be driven out of business, and the large firms are now going to have a different marginal factor cost, and they're going to grab those free workers. And so it would allow you to have a framework for thinking about things like minimum wages, which is much more engaging in what that actually is going on in the labor market. So I think that there's a lot of potential there. It's just getting started. So yeah.
Is it possible that those to do with non-cognitive skills? Some firms can do it high because they value certain non-cognitive skills. Since we don't observe them, we capture them, so we see they pay high.
Yeah.
Cognitive skills.
So, one version of that would be what I'm calling a sortative matching of these models. So the correlation between the worker effect and the firm effect. If you hire non-cognitive skill, it means that you get higher wages no matter where you work. That, in our models, that's just going to be absorbed in the fixed effect. Right? And if there's certain firms that value that more and pay higher wages, okay? When I say a firm pays higher wages, I mean it pays higher wages for the same worker. I don't mean it pays higher workers, like not adjusting to the workers they hired. I mean it pays higher wages for relative to other firms for those same workers. And so this is like a premium. It's not really a wage level, it's a wage premium. So if you thought that was true, that would be a possible story. My feeling is that,
so we are just in time. Thanks, David, again. So there were 2 or 3 points I just was supposed to say. Well, the drinks will be served in 2 minutes. The Aboriginal exhibition will be open, and you can go and walk around. There will be guides available, but you're not supposed to take your drinks, and you're also not supposed to take your bags into that exhibition. I learned something. I'm not a native speaker, but I learned that you can cloak your bags just around the corner, which I think means you can leave them and you get some kind of certificate so that you can pick them up afterwards. Now you can walk back to the hotel, which is actually a really nice walk. It's about 20 minutes, but you can also take a bus, and there will be buses from 9 o'clock onwards until 10:30. So enjoy the reception and have a very good evening.